Well, I'm very happy to be here today in this sunny space to read some poems from my third book of poetry, Live in Suspense, which has been a book that's taken some time to come together as I moved on and tried to figure out what I was writing in new ways after my first book, Theory of Devolution, some years ago, and my second book, Clay, which was named after my husband, Clay, whose life and times and character organized a lot of that book. He's a presence in this book as well, along with other elegies for parents and for people lost to AIDS in my past, AIDS and the mortality of that signifies being something that has always preoccupied me in all my writings. The title of the book came a little bit late in the process. I think more and more we're looking for, in poetry books, for things that make them cohere even more fully than we might have a few years ago with poetry books. And that interested me. And I began to look at the poems as I was putting the collection together to see how they might come together and speak to each other and what unified them, since there's everything from Bible stories in them retold, Kavafi poems retold, to the elegies I mentioned, and ultimately to some more maybe Buddhist places as well, where there's some comfort at the end, at the end of the book. So I realized that there was something holding them together, which was this idea of suspense. The idea of waiting, as I call it, waiting for the next mortal thing to happen. That we are all in that space in our lives, and certainly as we grow older, even more in that sense of what's happening next, even as we try to live in the present. So that ultimately emerged, and I began to write toward that idea of suspense in poems that I composed later as I was putting the book together. And it was originally called Suspense, but when I realized that if someone looked for that book under books, they would find every single mystery novel ever written that's suspenseful. So that was another reason to get this verb in there, this imperative of living in suspense, and also, which I think is a bit of a summons. So I'm going to read a few poems from this that I hope will suggest the range of the book one way or another, and ideally be pleasing in themselves and give a little sense of the different elements in it, the different landscapes in it, the different characters in the book as well. The first poem I'll read is the first poem in the book that is the title poem, as it turned out. And it also suggests a little bit of how I was trying to move on from Clay, the book, even as I was not necessarily moving on from Clay, the man. But it, I hope, sets up some of the issues in the book in a way that's engaging. Live in suspense. I leave Clay, but just for a weekend. Business, Los Angeles, so the risk is minimal. Still, each parting is practice. It's a little death, what Dunn and the others called orgasm, that intense suspension, the squeezing out, the metaphysicals said we didn't remake, not a river, but a draining lake. I embrace this shrug of separation, the unbrushed goodbye at 6 a.m., the plunge in the stomach as the elevator plunges downward, as the plane will not plunge, probably, nor will the lift crash on La Cienega or the boulevard fall into fissures, nor will Clay's bike collide with a truck on Route 9, plunging him down a palisade. Every risk is a rehearsal. We know what chance does. We know what death does, will do, has to do. Our bridges still hold us, though their cables quiver. Which is why, when I kiss Clay, I recall how HIV unchecked made our everyday a next to last, urgent as orgasm, until it was tamed as truth and metaphor. Which is why, when I kiss Clay, I taste the dust of his tongue. Re-erected with desire, we are metaphysical, the little death, a resonance away. Leaving him, I return to him. The book has a series of landscapes in it. There are a number of New York poems here, one or two I think of which I'll read, but also a lot in the Southwest, which is a kind of improbable landscape for me, a boy who grew up in New Jersey and has lived in New York for 907 years. And you'll see a couple different landscapes in this book. But this is another poem that's from the Southwest landscape. And I wrote it because I was fascinated with a particular bug. And as I put this book together, I realized more and more that there were insects all over it. My previous book, Clay, had birds all over it. And I don't even really like birds that much. But this book, I realized there was this motif of bugs. And you'll hear maybe a few others. And you'll hear one in here. And I kind of think, after I wrote this poem and thought about it more, that it was kind of my ode to a nightingale, my ode to a skylark, all those romantic with a capital R poems. But somehow it felt good to have a bug involved in that romantic enterprise. And this is called Desert Stink Beetle. It employs a strategy I like using a lot, maybe to a fault, and that is to have a poem that's all one sentence. So you'll hear that here. Desert Stink Beetle. You who gave your wings for more water, evolving to adhere them to your thorax until you became a shiny black capsule, a desert death reaper, a hearse of a bug, nosing the dirt as if you hunt your glasses, your butt in the sky like a high rider, comically sober, somberly comic, your exhaust, your line of defense, the 20-inch ray of spray you emit to get the last word, a stink you survive that lets you survive. My darkling, my thick drop of unmooned night, let me persist as your species, submit my wings to my torso, commit myself to ground, make my diet detritus and shit, evolve to be unlovely, a black ruby of gloom, a fecal American scarab, behind my earth-ridden face, my breath all bad, my ass in the air, my moon, ready to let it out, ready to take it in. This next poem is in a very different landscape, one that's a little more familiar to me because it's from the Northeast. It's a slightly longer poem, and again, not to thrust myself into the company of the Romantic poets, but it's kind of the thing that Wordsworth, tiresome as he can be, would do when he would trudge out to his various landscapes and write his odes. And again, this was something that I kind of realized after the fact in my own particular landscape. But again, I seem to be doing or trying to do some of those things those poets did when the poet goes out there and the world has intimations of immortality, or you're at Tintern Abbey and there are ruins and that matters to you. The landscape is the middle of Maine, and there's a lake there in this town called Monson, called Lake Hebron, and that name struck me a lot. So it's kind of a landscape poem, and I think brings a lot of my concerns together, some of which you've already heard, and this kind of extends them out a little bit. The poem, a little longer, it's a page and a half. Disbelieving these deaths, I go to sit by Lake Hebron. A thunderstorm has spun from a near blue sky, then faded like a tantrum, the child sunny and unharmed. Warmth like a human's breath shrugs off the fall wind. The lake is only mildly disturbed. It didn't know the deceased, so its sympathies don't extend to empathy, and it's a lake, not a pathetic fallacy, though I try. I work to stay here, not to be netted to various keenings. Hard to do, even on a good day. In the shallows are the slabs of slate, like coffins fallen off a truck, each one not containing a body I knew, although slate caskets, irretrievable in water, speak to me. They inform me that if I were really here, I'd notice the cloud very like a whale until it blossoms like a poppy, fast. A chorus of dead from a chorus of caskets ought to open their lids and shoulder out their slabs to walk on water. My dead father would eye the lake for plops of fish he could catch and feel guilty for eating eye to eye, though he was dubious of lakes, preferring currents, local water strung to seas, which lets me see him as a river, bodies of water as bodies, as metaphors, including the Babylon waters of weeping. My mother, city-born, should stride to me across the tidelessness, the wind revealing her girlish nape, and George, my most recent dead guy, cleared of the thunder behind his brow, and now rise right here, part of the democracy of day, along with Daniel Chrisman, 25, dead on 9/11, 18 years ago today, a man I know from a poster gladly diving at 43 into this crisp water, warmer than dying young. All my loves with AIDS, the guys who I drag everywhere, Ron, Len, Craig, Jay, Paul, John, Mark, Tom, Richard, the Armada ghosting the cove, their wakes cut short, should land on the island I am. Hebron, the first city, arid, blazes from across the ocean, its millennia of murders, histories bleeding into each other, torches and missiles and rifles like lake lightning. Children killed in cars or cages. They should splash. All of these once knew the word for lake, said lake, swam in a lake of genuine water, fell through the frosty metaphor of lake, their lips too blue and sown ever to say lake again. Here they are, none of them at all, evaporated out of time until I become a lake nobody swims in. Again, the trees tremble, the clouds lower their cliche of brow, the water snaps like a shroud. It is a day in September, more thunder to come. The lake is alive with togue, perch, and bass. There are a number of poems in the book that begin with the phrase, a boy's own, which is kind of almost a classic phrase some of us may remember, or our fathers would certainly remember, for our kind of boys study kind of thing, for the Boy Scout mentality of how to be a boy and a man through lessons or information. So there are a number of them here around Bible stories especially, and this one is called A Boy's Own Jesus. The older brother I never had, the one who knew the way to the bathroom in the dark, okay with rushed prayers. He who witnessed the fists gut me to breathlessness, able to sleep during storms, trustworthy, though with erratic tempests, like a father after a few drinks. Never a father, keeping distance from his own hard father. Suffering little children who suffered, yet suffering when I lay my weight on him and made his thighs tingle. Shaking his head at my penis, pronging this pollution, this boy distraction. Looking good in a loincloth, his pained muscles turning me truant. Desire and dying made one body. In my fevers, rising with robe wings over my wild boat, feeling fevered too, keen to each degree, making me his special boy. His arms held and wrestled me, a cradle or a cage, devil or deliverer. I live in New York City, and this poem takes place in that landscape. I spend a lot of time on the streets, looking at people, thinking about them, and trying to imagine their lives and somehow interact with them. And this is a poem about that. The title is a line from the second to last line of a poem by Theodore Roethke called Elegy for Jane, My Student Thrown by a Horse. And the title, with that line stolen from him, is I with no rights in this matter. All day I have been looking for my children, who I know will never exist. I do not find them in the forms of my students, though I would pluck them out of traffic as if my genes were speaking. Nor are my children my nieces and nephews, whose blood bears resemblances to my own, in whom I echo. They have parents to belong to, and I borrow them. Tangled amid the toddlers and strollers, the elementary kids skipping beside their dads to school, the 10-year-olds walking boldly alone past the chanting man and the compost bin, the sullen or screeching teens, all angry angles, their parents, practiced men and women who once as babies might have sat on my lap and now run enterprises. I am where among them? My non-procreation seemed a condition of my freedom. I, who slept from man to man, who lived like a boy, who felt like no one's father, not even his own, who, in the prime of his sperm, expected his semen was deadly, who saw men of a generation give birth to death, his ejaculations dead ends, ciphers of surges and love, who can't run fast enough to catch the fading train. Still, I feel in the fork of my genes those millions I produce even now, however warped and bent, clamoring to make half the child I will not make, striving inside me as I try to bear the mostly straight world stranger children, offspring owned by no one really, amazing in their incipient decay, stray as leaves and already scattering, running to the risk of the intersection, all of them my letters to God on the street. I let them run ahead of me. There are a number of poems in the book that speak to Constantine Cavafy, the wonderful Greek poet from the turn, I guess, in the early part of the 20th century, who for many of us has been the great poet of furtive, lost, and remembered desire. And I love Cavafy's poems, and they were some of the first kind of queer poems, I guess, I ever read in college, and I think even in high school. And at the same time, Cavafy's poems are frustrating to me and sometimes really annoying because of those sneaky moments and the kind of preciousness of memories of fleeting desire. And I wanted to bring those poems kind of into the present in his whole Days of series, Days of 1905, Days of 1911, whatever the years were. And certain other poets have done this as well, including Mark Doty, James Merrill, and others. But I wanted to kind of record my own days and see how those days would be different in a different time and through a different poetic sensibility. And this is one of them. Days of 1986. My suspect blood. Dr. Soroti filled a vial. I had to take myself down the grim avenue to the Board of Health in the cold spring evening, crosswalk after crosswalk, as the sun sidled in. I saw hundreds of others like me bearing their blood, but inside their bodies. The vial, I wanted to pluck it from my backpack and prop it on top of a payphone or stash it in a trash can with the dead daily news, wanting no news, not even good news, all news cleaving me from my brothers. But I kept taking steps. The street annoying with life, the sun incumbent, the storefronts bloody gold, until I had to enter the Board of Health to find an unguarded tray of vials and place mine among them, all of us numbered, together an hour before. I went back into a city vital with night, the world a blade so cutting that at times I could feel. The poems in this book move from, I think, this kind of place of anxiety and intense suspensefulness about what's happened in the past and how that leads into the present. It's populated with various people, And I hope toward the end, that I was able, as I figured out the arc of the book, to move into a more place of resting in suspense, as I found myself calling it. Still maintaining that sense of yikes, that tension, but also unclenching a little bit through a sense of of relaxing the need for the self. One friend of mine, a therapist, talks about her process of disidentification and moving kind of beyond the boundaries of the body. And in certain of these poems, I do that even as I'm trying to grapple with what the afterlife is and how we make sense of our mortal selves. In my first book, Theory of Devolution, I had a long poem with that title, and the last part of it is kind of a summons to a lover to kind of move past our body selves into something else. And I say in that poem that what matters is matter, and that the body is like the dishwasher or coat hanger. And it's important, if we can, to kind of summon ourselves ideally together to do that, to be that place of matter. And I'm not a practicing Buddhist. Clay is closer to that. He's a kind of existential Episcopalian in his practice, and he has a Buddhist Christian Sangha. And he refers to a term from a Catholic theologian, how certain people were anonymous Christians, and who they didn't know they were, which is a little presumptuous, or maybe around Christianity as being the thing. But I like the idea almost that maybe I'm kind of an anonymous Buddhist, that I'm in a place not necessarily of regular practice, but through poetry and this kind of grappling with connections and self, more into a place of ultimately, at my best, relaxing into that. Doesn't always happen. I'm still anxious about lots of things at 3 in the morning and 3 in the afternoon, but you'll see in a few of the poems I'm reading now, maybe some rest, some resonance, some restoration. And this is a poem kind of about that, I think. I'll read one that kind of focuses in that area, and you'll see it's, again, a page and a half. This based on something that actually happened to me, and as you'll hear from the kind of epigraph of the poem with a little italicized reading line. But it kind of struggles with some of the larger questions of like what it means to be living and what life offers in any kind of enduring or post-mortal way. I should say that my father was an Episcopal priest, so I grew up kind of confusing God the Father with God the Dad, and even as we were not evangelical, we had a whole superstructure of faith and belief and liturgy and rubric and guilt and shame that was part of this, even as my father, I think, felt challenged by some of those ideas, as you'll hear in this poem. It's called A Boy's Own Heaven. And the epigraph or the reading line is, a friend asks me to pray for the soul of his dead brother. For you, I go back to my boyhood dead, said by my dad to hover above us, out of body, but a flight in time, pendant, weightless and waiting like bees that shiver against the nectar until God raises their corpses to seed their souls. Such a tensed suspension for a boy to hold. Dad didn't talk heaven much, as if it was a prison we shouldn't visit, as if suggesting it would bring it on, like the black cat crossing or graveyard whistling, like cloudbursts or raw luck, like coins disappearing down a drain, the cheery, not right now, right place, belied by the crying widow, by you, my friend, whose brother now in my grown life is terribly gone. You who expect a resurrection that for me, in my avoidant ignorance, is now or never or then, the dead bro, dead or sleeping or looking down on us in joy, or in the waiting room with a tattered time, to be roused awake for judgment. He who needs a prayer like a dollar dropped on the street, or else is compost. I cannot choose to choose. I asked and asked what prayer, what help we too could give to a God who, if he is, does what he deigns, it seems, without our asks, who grabs the wheel and blows through every intersection. But for you, my brotherless friend, you who have a God who lives in a lattice of a greater web you think we humans can tug to make it glisten like an angel's feather and summon a net you think we quiver into your brother's salvation filigree, I pray to a dad and dud of a God who may be diagnosably indifferent. No matter my own dad, whose form has split from its cell of soul, if soul is the word, but like you, says pray. God of Possimal Gossamer, please let all of us brothers entangle ourselves in embrace. I also found, even as I found a number of insects in this book, and maybe you'll find them on your own, maybe I'll find another insect poem to read, had dogs in this. There were dogs in the book too, and they kind of just crept in 2 or 3 poems. And this is one of them that, again, I think is speaking toward a different kind of sense of what it means to be a self in the long term. And it's called Birthday Wish. The dog doesn't know he's a dog, though he knows all he needs to know to be a dog. That tree over there, the one with 2 branches conducting green music, can't spell chlorophyll or chill. It does not bark like a dog. The tree knows to shed its coat when autumn comes, and the dog senses he sheds his fur in spring. Such contrary seasons, unconscious of being seasons or seasons passing, just as the dog won't know when he's not a dog, and the maple won't comprehend the hatchet coming, or the rot or fire. May I, like the dog, the tree, their limbs, their bark, their barklessness, the coming fall, the fire, the hatchet, and the rot, know only what I need to be. This poem is a little different, I think, from some of the ones you've heard, and it's one I enjoy reading. Reading and writing it was kind of a surprise for me. Robert Frost said, no surprise for the writer, no surprise for the reader. But it's wonderful when you suddenly access a part of yourself or a knowledge about the self, the body, how you love, where something new comes out. And after I wrote this poem and worked on it more, I thought, I'm seeing other moments in it that do the same thing as this poem, this elusiveness about how the self has manifested in the world. And it's also one pretty long, if skinny, sentence, and covers some ground over time. Where is the lady? Where is the lady I was when I was 4? A stole of blanket around my neck, a purse of a pail exquisite on my wrist, my heels held high, toes sallied forward on stilettos of air. I, the loveliest mother's lovely friend, caught up in my designs, so dizzy with my perfume I had to swan my cloud wherever it was I walked. No matter it was who looked, their distaste, a hazy buzz, almost undeterred, by my father's regular scowl as he waved his flat palm down, a flash of signal that said to drop my feet to the floor of the malehood that we shared. I, the child he wished would shed the girl like a dress, weight the pail with sand, run with the lift of kids, and keep an eye on the ball. The being my mother assured my father was a phrase for this Dr. Spock of a kid, but also the puzzling son whose picture my father took, developed, and showed whose photos are why I see the vision of who I was, the runaway fairy of child when ladyship swelled in me like a bodice or a bloodstream, until the purse no longer appealed, or the heels hurt too much to bear, or children began their games and shame was the weightiest mink. And I shrugged on the boy, incited to put aside the childish things of girls, boyishness his resort, who tethered himself to men, who loved not trucks but cars, not for their engines but for the lushness of their lines, for the sleekness in their speed, who came to love his gun, who drove away whoever she was he might have been, not knowing who I could be then or could be now, this man who daily wears a suit that seems to fit his frame, his loafers almost light, who can almost locate the scent of the girl he sent to her room, dressing for her party, craving an invitation. I'll read just a couple more that maybe speak again to this sense of what the self is doing. And I've written a lot in the book about my parents, poems I've not necessarily shared directly this time, but elegies for my mother who died some 21 years ago now, and my father who died just 5 years as I was putting this book together. But they're here all the time as current figures, as well as kind of avatars, figures, ghosts who beckon or don't. And this is a poem, again, from late in the group, where the mother figure, who's a bit problematic in her loving, has a slightly different role. And it's called Like a Simile. My dead mother sneaks up on me when I don't know I need her. If a tiny piece of masonry, the finger of a gargoyle, falls inside me and I feel its current, she appears without asking, a glint of her sure self, her own person, but mine too. And my body steps ahead. I see my shadow move, as if she's roused me for school, as if I now know what to say. As if, when I'm dying, she will unevanesce at my bedside, a trick of the brain's electric flicker, or like that trick. I've heard that happens, but I've never been close enough to know. I wonder if the trick is all of it, or if the charge of the nerve shutting down is as real as it gets, the parent appearing because she appears. It seems as if she should be there, because she was there at the start, the mother of the thing, half of the instigation, the spring of the river that is its own river. I distrust apparitions. I consent to science in my ignorance of it and of spirit. I rely on a rationale for which I have no taxonomy. Unlike faith, I take it on faith. There she is again, or there is her notion. Is she someone you know? Today, she sends me off stronger in my senses, my integument resilient, like it or not. Tomorrow, or in 10 years, I ask you, will she be my docent out? It's as if I see her beckon me beyond my nerves, as if calling me into the car she drives, her left arm out the window, already tanned, the beauty marks darkening. And as she steps on the gas, as if we are late for vacation, my back goes back to stick to the vinyl seat, both of us with eyes on the road, as if, because she knows where we went, she knows where we are going. I'll read, I think, two more, And this poem, which is the second to last in the book, you'll hear refers back to the poem I read earlier, with that kind of italicized line, which is now the title of this poem. And it's also got it's a short poem, and it's got another insect in it. A friend asks me to pray for the soul of his dead brother. The flying cricket, in a frenzy of chirps, sketches my halo. Maybe it harps on me as the mate it aches for, or else I hinder desire. It blurs like a hand making the sign of the cross too fast and too long. Finished, it spins off into September cold, a thread, an echo. So that poem speaks to the kind of more rhetorical poem addressed to the friend who lost his brother, and it comes again to nature and a bug, which is maybe what we all come to. This is the last poem I will read. It's not one I read very often, but I like it, and I hope it brings us back to the initial themes of Live in Suspense. It has a bit of a context, which I'll mention just briefly. I was part in 2019 of a small micro residency program here in New York called Poets Afloat, where a number of poets in the spring of the year were invited to be to board different boats and barges in New York City and write for a day, inspired by what they saw. I was on a barge in Red Hook, Brooklyn, which was really wonderful, and I have a poem that I'm not going to read called Gribbles, which is another kind of insect or micro poem. I'll just mention it because it's got kind of bugs in it, and gribbles are kind of a sea worm that are termites essentially of the sea and of wood. So that was inspired by this barge and by learning about them. But so was looking at New York Harbor and the idea of what bridges do and how we cross them, which is definitely part of Suspense. And there are certainly certain bridges as a motif, occasionally at least, in these poems. But this, I hope, is a bit more of a rousing kind of version of what suspense means, and a bit more rousing version of what it means to have your Thelma and Louise moment, let's call it that. It's a page-long poem, and it's called Suspense. Building this bridge, they died, venturing into the pilings, then rising inside caissons too fast. Their lungs exploded. Through dying, they taught their survivors the science of pressure, how humans might measure, defy, and heighten their depths. From those gravestones hangs the swaying weight of suspension, the waver of roadway, the roar of undulation that, in a tension with vibration, a flaw in the aeroelastics, a flutter as in the atria, in some perfected resonance, can send the structure down. As will happen, my car and I plunging into seconds of suspense, piercing New York Harbor, pausing to consider what it means to float, then descending into a building darkness, then definite darkness, becoming within the bay a human place, my capsule of car and body unsuspended and resting, the rightful water seeping and then sweeping in before the divers arrive to pluck me back to the sun, my heart bursting. Thank you very much.